Hello everyone, welcome back to Chess Master Journey. Today we're going to look at part 18 King's Pawn opening, which is Vienna game. So let's take a look at the position of Vienna game first. White piece, E pawn to E4 square. Black piece, E pawn to E5 square. Then C3 square. Okay, so this is the position for Vienna game. Okay, now let's take a look at the variations that we have under this Vienna game. What are the variations we can get from the moves of the pieces? So now let's say we continue the game by moving the black knight to f6 square. Black knight to f6 square. So now this is known as the Vienna game Fogbeer variation. Okay, as you can see the name in the screen. Okay, so this position is known as the Vienna game Fogbeer variation. So let's continue the game. Perhaps for the white, now we can see what will happen if we move the G pawn to G3 square. So G pawn to G3 square. And now in this position, as you can see, this is known as the Vienna game Miser's variation. So this is the Miser's variation of Vienna game. So let's continue the game. We can move the black D pawn to D5 square. And now in this position, the white pawn goes after the black pawn. So EX D5. And the black knight goes after the white pawn and X D5. Further, we can develop the bishop for the white pieces. So bishop to G2 square. And here what we can do is probably we can use the black knight to capture the knight in the C3 square. So knight capture 3 and X C3. And now the B pawn captures the knight BX C3. So this is how you can develop the game under the Miser's variation, and also from the Fogbeer variation it becomes the Miser's variation. So now let's say if we didn't move the G pawn here earlier, so let's say we choose to move the bishop to C4 square, bishop to C4 square, and now here this becomes as the Stanley variation of Vienna game. As you can see the position on the screen. So this is known as the Stanley variation. So to continue the game, the black piece can move the knight to C6 square. And now as you can see, this is known as the Stanley variation of 3 knights variation. Okay, so now to continue, we can, for the white, you can move the D pawn to D3 square. Okay, here as you can see, this becomes the opening of Vienna hybrid. So this is known as the Vienna hybrid. So now what you can do is perhaps the black can move its knight to A5 square and the G knight to E2 square. Now here what I can do is the black knight captures the bishop, so NX C4, and here the pawn goes up to the knight, so DX C4. And now you can move, for the black you can move the bishop to C5 square. So for the white now you can go for the king safety castling. And the black pieces, probably you can use the D pawn to move to D6 square. So this is how you can develop the game under the Vienna hybrid and also the Stanley variation. So this is how you develop the game under the Vienna game from Falkbeer variation to Stanley variation, and then you go for the Vienna hybrid. Okay, this one happens if you had moved the bishop to c4 square earlier. Now let's say we don't use the bishop, let's say we go for f pawn, so f pawn to f4 square, and this is known as the Vienna gambit. This is known as the Vienna gambit. So to continue the game, you can push your d pawn to d5 square. So now this one becomes the Vienna gambit main line. So this position is the main line of the Vienna gambit. So next what we can do is the f pawn goes after the e pawn, so fx e5, and the black knight goes after the e pawn, so nx e4. And now for the white, you can develop the minor piece, the knight to f3 square. And for the black, you can develop the bishop to e7 square. So in this position, as you can see, now this one from the main line, it becomes the Brier variation. So this is known as the Vienna gambit Brier variation. So this is how you develop the piece. Yeah. Further, you can use the black knight to capture the white knight, so nx c3. So this is how you can develop the pieces under the Brier variation. So this one happens when you use the move the f pawn to f4 square just now. And let's say we don't use the f pawn, we go for the a pawn. So a pawn to a3 square. Okay, now this is known as the Megherini variation under the Vienna game. So to continue the game, the black piece, you can move the knight to c6 square, and then the white knight to f3 square. So now this one becomes the four knights game Gunzburg variation. So it goes for the four knights game. So this is how you develop the pieces under the Megherini variation. So if you move the a3 pawn. So let's just refresh back. So for the Vienna game, you move your e4, e5 and c3. Just now we looked at what are the variations we have if we move the knight to f6 square. So now let's say we move the b knight to c6 square. So what are the variations we have under this position? So once you move the knight to c6 square, this is known as the Vienna game Max Lange defense. So under this defense for the white, what you can do is, first let's say if we move the g pawn. So let's say we move the g pawn to g3. So this is known as Paulsen variation. As you can see the position here, this is known as the Paulsen variation. So to continue the game, we move the bishop to c5 square. So bishop to c5 square. And then the white bishop to g2 square. So further we can push the black a pawn to a6 square. And for the white, you can use the knight to go to e2 square. And for the black, you can develop your pawn to d6 square. So this is how you can develop your game under the Paulsen variation of Vienna game. So let's go a bit more further. Let's say for the white, you use the d pawn to d3 square. And now here you can develop the black knight to e7 square. And for the white, you can go for the castling. So this is one of the way to develop the pieces under the Paulsen variation. So let's say in the initial state we don't go for g3 move, but we go for the bishop to c4 square. Okay, and then further continue the game, we use the knight to f6 square. So now this is known as the Vienna game of Stanley variation and the king 3 knights variation. So we are going back to just now's moves also. So we are getting the same variation, but let's say just we go further in front more. So we used to move the d pawn to d3, and this becomes the Vienna hybrid, like what just now we saw, the Vienna hybrid. So this shows the same variations as just now. So let's say now we don't go for bishop, we go for f pawn to f4 square. So now this is also known as the Vienna gambit. So let's take further look. So in this position, the e pawn is going to capture the f pawn, so ex f4, and we're going to develop the white knight to f3 square. So this is known as the Vienna gambit, Steinheit's gambit. So we have both in it. Then for the black, you can develop the g pawn to g5 square. And for the white, you can go for the d pawn to d4 square. So now here in this position, this is known as the Vienna gambit and also the Pierce gambit. Now for the black turn, you can move the g pawn to g4 square. So for the white, you can develop the bishop to c4 square. So this is how you can develop the game under the Vienna gambit, and if initially you had moved the f4 pawn. So we do it. So this is how you can develop your pieces and the variations you have under the Max Lange defense. So let's take a look at some other variation. Just now we moved this knight to c6 square, and now let's say we use the bishop now. The bishop to c5 square. So now this position, now it is known as the Vienna game Anderson defense. So under this Anderson defense, what we can do is, first let's say we move the knight to f3 square, and then we can, for the black, you can develop the d pawn to d6 square, and the white pawn to d4 square. So in here, the e pawn goes after the d pawn, ex d4, and now the knight goes after the pawn, nx d4. So now for the black, the knight goes to f6 square. For the white, you can develop the bishop to g5 square. So this is how you can develop your pieces under the Anderson game. So let's go a bit more further. So let's say we use the h pawn to h6 square. So it's an attack. So for the bishop, so the bishop chooses to come to h4 square. And now the black can go for the castling. So this is how you can move your pieces under the Vienna game of Anderson defense. And let's say you don't want to move the knight. So the another option you can go for is you can go for, probably you can choose the bishop to c4 square. So bishop to c4 square. So for the black, we go to the knight to f6 square. And we can also move the d pawn to d3 square. Okay, so if you can see this position in the screen, this is known as the bishop's opening of the Vienna hybrid Spalman attack. So this is the Vienna hybrid Spalman attack. So to continue the game, the black can push the d pawn to d6 square, and then the knight to a4 square. Then you can bring your bishop to b6 square. So that is how you can the Vienna hybrid. So let's just recap what we have learned today. So for the Vienna game, the position would be e4, e5, and c3 square, and you can move the pieces and also look at the variations that you can get as what we go through just now. So that is an overview under the King's Pawn opening for the Vienna game. So just to remind you all out there, a person is a person no matter how small you are. Just like a pawn, you are powerful too. So see you all in the next lesson. Bye, and don't forget to subscribe the Chess Master Journey. Thank you.